Location, Tarbrax, Scotland. Date, August 27, 1992. Time, 10:40 p.m. Source, RSV. Andes, 14 times 81, UFO Casebook.
Two men, Gary Wood and Colin Wright, were on a business trip when they rounded a blind corner in the vicinity of the Harpering Reservoir. Suddenly Colin abruptly leaned forward, exclaiming, "What the hell's that?" Gary peered through the windscreen. There ahead of the car, floating about 20 feet above the road, was a two-tiered disc-shaped object. He remembers it being about 30 feet wide, wider than the road, smooth, black and shiny, with no windows or illuminations. Gary, a motor mechanic by trade, found the appearance and finish of the object unusual. Wanting to get away as quickly as possible, he floored the accelerator, urging their vehicle up to almost 70 mph. They passed below the hovering craft. A shimmering curtain of light descended on the car. Gary describes it as like looking at a detuned TV set, just flickering lights. Instantly they were enveloped in total, complete darkness. Later, under hypnosis, Gary recalled standing, presumably, outside the car. It was still totally and utterly dark, not a hint of light. He could not even see the car. Briefly, he thought they had crashed and he was dead. He blacked out for what, subjectively, felt like a few seconds, then abruptly he was awake and the car was veering all over the road. The following day Gary felt utterly drained of energy, more than just the result of his late night. He felt really worn out. His sleeping patterns changed for the worse. Eventually consulted a doctor because of severe headaches. Soon Gary consulted several well-known investigators and agreed to undergo hypnosis. During the first session, Gary became very emotional and burst into tears. There was nothing specific, only vague memories and impressions. Later regression sessions were to prove much more revealing. In later sessions, both men remembered sitting in the car, which was stopped in the middle of the road. Small humanoid creatures, 3 to each side, opened both front doors. One recalled Gary being placed on a type of stretcher or carrier. None of the entities were supporting it. The stretcher was free-floating. Gary, although he remembers none of this, does recall creatures approaching the car and then a searing pain in his abdomen, as if his stomach muscles were being torn apart. For his part, Colin recalls walking up a ramp into the craft, which was lit by a dazzling white light. He remembers being in a circular corridor, being led by one of the creatures. The room was utterly featureless except for an unusual chair. It was curiously curved, almost organic in shape. He was stripped naked and placed unresisting in the chair and subjected to some type of non-intrusive physical examination. He also remembers lying back in the chair looking at the ceiling. It was corrugated, translucent. There was soft, diffused lighting filtering through. His next memory was of being naked in a transparent container made from material rather like glass or perspex. Straps at the feet and ankles secured him. Outside the container, he could clearly see other men and women, all naked and all in transparent containers like his. Blowing around outside the container was a mist rather like the fog created by dry ice for stage and film visual effects. He also saw a number of tall, humanoid creatures. One was standing framed in a doorway opposite him, and another 3 were approaching the container in which he was imprisoned. Abruptly, the transparent material of his container began to frost up. He began to weep. No sooner had he done this than the frosting began to retreat, almost like a film sequence running in reverse, until the material was once again perfectly clear. Colin nervously watched as an angular device rose from the floor. It was long and thin, like a rod with a small triangular head. 2 glowing red lights were set into one of the sides. There was a peculiar appendage about halfway along the length of the device, and the base was joined at the floor. The entire machine moved up and down continuously, and the appendage swung from left to right. Although there was no pain, Colin thought it might be scanning him. Gary recalled being in a featureless circular room lying on a flat table. He was unable to move, although he does not recall being physically strapped down. He was aware of a black lens-shaped device in the center of the room. The device was twisting and turning almost as if it were folding on itself. It reminded Gary of a Mobius strip. It made a whooshing sound as if air was being displaced. As he watched the device in fascination, he suddenly became aware of a long, thin, translucent arm extending over his chest towards his head. The arm abruptly dropped onto his chest near his shoulder. On another occasion, he remembers a hole forming in the floor. It was filled with a viscous liquid of some kind, like a gel. While he watched this, a small column rose from the floor. Gary described it as resembling a tin can. It continued until it was about 3 feet above the floor. The device gave out a noise rather like an electric motor and began to rotate slowly. The of the cylinder rose from the main body and extended towards him until it was level with his eyes. The tip had 2 red, glowing dots. At this point, Gary noticed the pool of liquid start to vibrate. From this liquid, a tall, incredibly thin, frail-looking creature slowly, almost painfully emerged. Although resembling a traditional gray, it appeared emaciated, like a skeleton covered in skin. He remembers that the skin over its ribs looked discolored and bruised. He later discovered that all the creatures had difficulty with the gravity and atmospheric pressure, particularly the tall, thin, translucent creatures that frequently tended to fall over. Bizarrely, he also recalled a small man, apparently quite human in nature, dressed in a neat black suit complete with collar and tie, who was watching the proceedings. He was standing among the entities, all of which seemed quite deferential towards him. In all, Wood remembers being around 20 or 30 creatures present, the majority tall, a pallid gray color, and frail-looking. One notable variation from this was a smaller, rather bizarre-looking being with an odd heart-shaped face. On its face were some strangely familiar markings. These comprised of colored facial stripes, 3 diagonally on each cheek. These were reminiscent of the tribal markings normally associated with members of the Native American tribes. He looked at the creatures and mentally asked, "Why are you doing this?" The answer that appeared in his mind was surprising and not a little disturbing. One word: sanctuary. While he was in telepathic communication with the creature, he was able to see fragments of its existence, as if the process was a two-way street. Further communication, the being said, "In many ways you are more advanced than us, but you have been capped." Just what capped means is open to question. Gary is certain that at one point they were taken underground. From the table where he lay, he could see tunnels leading off from a huge, central chamber hewn from solid rock. There was also an enormous machine close to him. Possibly it was another flying machine like the one he had witnessed above the road. Gary's most worrying memory was seeing a young woman seated naked on the floor, facing the wall. One of the tall creatures was standing beside her. As Gary looked at her, she turned her head towards him. Her hair was in a loose, shaggy perm with blonde highlights. She was sitting shivering with her knees drawn up to her chin. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, cradling herself. She had been crying and was clearly in the same predicament as him. Gary became deeply involved in the study of UFOs. Colin, on the other hand, refuses to discuss the matter.